It started with a tiny mark on a woolly bear caterpillar, nature's warning of an unforgiving winter. While the town frantically patched their cabins, a quiet veteran and his German shepherd scavenged an old junkyard. Suddenly, the dog froze, nose pointed at a rusted object in the shadows. A massive freezing metal silo. Sam touched the icy steel and whispered, "This will keep us alive." Why choose to live in a freezing tin can right before a historic ice storm? What Sam built inside reveals an engineering genius no one saw coming, and his midnight rescue will restore your faith in outcasts. Before we start, grab a warm drink, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The wind howling through the dense pine forests of Cascade Locks, Oregon, carried an unnatural, biting chill. The late autumn sky had hardened into an impenetrable sheet of lead, pressing down on the trees. The air tasted metallic, a silent promise of an impending frost threatening to swallow the woods whole. It was a cold that didn't just touch the skin, it sank directly into the bones. Sam Higgins stood on the rotting porch of his cabin, watching the tree line blur into the gray horizon. He was 46, though the deep weather-beaten lines etched around his eyes and the permanent tension in his jaw made him appear a decade older. His short chestnut brown hair was fading into ash, and a thin, silver-streaked beard framed a rugged, unsmiling face. Stepping to the edge of the porch, the freezing wind tugged at his uniform of isolation. A faded beige field jacket over an untucked button-up shirt, dark charcoal chinos, and heavily worn brown work boots. Every deep scuff on the leather told the story of a man walking endless miles in solitude, desperate to hide from a world that had grown too loud. A former Navy Seabee, Sam was a combat engineer who once built vital infrastructure in the heart of chaotic war zones. He survived the physical dangers, but now carried the invisible, jagged shrapnel of a war that had never truly ended. He lived in the fragile spaces between seconds, bracing for impacts that were no longer there. The sudden crack of a falling pine branch could send his heart slamming against his ribs, his brain translating the sound into the thunderous detonation of a mortar shell. The suffocating noise of crowds or the screech of tires felt like a relentless ambush. This invisible war had driven him into the isolating embrace of the Cascade Mountains to quiet the agonizing echoes in his head. Operating as a wandering agricultural mechanic, he found a fragile purpose. He drove to remote farms along the valley, fixing broken tractors and rusted water pumps. There was a profound peace in the predictable logic of gears, grease, and steel. Machines made sense. If a part was broken, it could be diagnosed and welded. It was a deeply comforting contrast to the human mind, which, once shattered, could rarely be put back together exactly as it was. Yet, Sam was never truly alone. Walking step for step beside his worn boots was Major, a 5-year-old German shepherd of magnificent stature and unwavering loyalty. Major possessed a thick brown-black coat that absorbed the dim forest light and deep amber eyes holding an ancient, almost mythological intelligence. His slightly curved tail swayed with a measured, protective rhythm. Major was Sam's vital anchor to reality, a living tether keeping the veteran from drifting into the dark abyss of flashbacks. When memories threatened to pull Sam under, when his breathing grew shallow and his calloused hands trembled, Major would step in. The dog would press his heavy, warm head firmly against Sam's knee, a silent, powerful command to return to the present. The German shepherd possessed a supernatural intuition, sensing chemical shifts in Sam's body long before panic set in. Moving like silent ghosts under the towering pines, this solitary pack of two needed no words to understand each other. Sam's connection to the human world was frayed down to a single thread: Dr. Evelyn Hayes, the aging physician at the small-town clinic. A week prior, an ugly gash from a slipped wrench had forced Sam into her bright office. Major had sat faithfully by the clinic's front door, ignoring the nervous townsfolk, his amber eyes locked on the window, until Sam emerged. Doctor Hayes, a woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, possessed skin mapped with sun-baked wrinkles and piercingly bright hazel eyes. Most importantly, those eyes were devoid of pity. While the townspeople saw Sam as a broken toy to be whispered about with misguided sympathy, Dr. Hayes just saw a man. She stitched his arm with brusque, professional warmth. She never offered hollow platitudes or used that soft, condescending tone reserved for the wounded. She was the only beacon of humanity that didn't burn his eyes to look at. A quiet reminder that perhaps the outside world wasn't entirely unbearable. This year, however, the forest's isolation felt less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully laid trap. The atmosphere had grown heavy with a creeping menace. Inside Sam's dilapidated cabin, sitting on a wobbly crate, a battered radio continuously crackled, spitting harsh static into the quiet room. Interspersed with the white noise were urgent broadcasts from the National Weather Service. The announcer's usually calm voice carried a tight edge of genuine alarm. He warned of an anomalous polar vortex, a massive, unstable system of Arctic air gathering apocalyptic strength. Poised to sweep down and engulf the Pacific Northwest in a catastrophic freeze, it was predicted to be the most devastating temperature drop in half a century, threatening to snap the fragile power grid in half. But a man who had survived the chaotic madness of a war zone didn't rely solely on a radio to know when a deadly enemy approached. Sam listened to the earth, and the wilderness was screaming its own desperate warnings. For weeks, the natural world had moved with terrified urgency. The wild geese had already fled south in massive, hurried V formations an entire month early, looking as if they were outrunning a silent hunter. In the surrounding woods, squirrels were frantically hoarding food with a manic energy. Major had spent days by the window, watching the small creatures bury an astronomical amount of hickory nuts deep into the rapidly hardening soil. The most chilling prophecy, however, came in the smallest of packages. That morning, Sam had knelt by his porch to observe a woolly bear caterpillar crawling across a splintered piece of firewood. Mountain folklore was treated as absolute law here. The narrower the brown band on the caterpillar's fuzzy body, the harsher the winter. Sam stared at the creature. It was almost entirely pitch black, with only a razor-thin sliver of brown wrapped around its center. Nature had passed its grim judgment. A deadly, unforgiving freeze was coming to wipe the slate clean. Sam stood up, his knees aching from the cold dampness, and looked back at his home. The wooden cabin was a fragile, decaying relic. The roof sagged dangerously under decades of neglect. Its wooden shingles curled and rotting. The wind whistled a mournful tune through widening gaps in the warped logs, bringing the bitter taste of ice. If the polar vortex hit with the predicted ferocity, this thin wooden shell would offer no protection. It would become a frozen tomb. The small cast-iron stove in the corner was useless, its heat escaping through 100 invisible cracks faster than the fire could produce it. Sam looked down at Major. The German shepherd sat patiently, his thick coat ruffling in the freezing wind, his amber eyes fixed steadily on his master. The dog trusted him implicitly with his life. A familiar knot tightened painfully in Sam's chest. Sam wasn't afraid of dying. He had made peace with that years ago in foreign deserts, but he would not let the cold take his only friend. He needed to build a fortress against an invisible, freezing enemy that couldn't be shot or negotiated with. As the wind howled louder, violently shaking the brittle pine branches, his CB engineering mind calculated the odds. With a sinking dread, he realized that patching the rotting wood wouldn't be enough. To survive the apocalyptic freeze nature had promised, the scarred veteran and his loyal dog didn't just need firewood or extra blankets. They needed a miracle. The late afternoon sun offered no warmth as it hung low and pale over the sprawling, frost-bitten acreage of the Miller farm, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dying fields. Sam Higgins lay flat on the unyielding, frozen earth, his grease-stained hands working methodically beneath the massive belly of a broken-down John Deere combine harvester. A bitter wind swept across the open valley plains, biting mercilessly at his exposed knuckles and carrying the sharp, metallic scent of an impending snowstorm. Sam welcomed the numbing cold. It kept him sharply grounded in the present moment, anchoring his restless mind to the tactile reality of the heavy steel wrench, the pungent smell of aged diesel fuel, and the predictable, logical puzzle of a jammed transmission. Standing a few yards away, observing him with a quiet, respectful distance, was Arthur Miller. The 72-year-old widower was a man seemingly carved from the very harsh land he had worked his entire life. Arthur was tall but stooped, burdened by decades of grueling labor, with a face that resembled sun-cured tobacco, deeply creased, leathery, and perpetually set in a stoic, unreadable expression. A thick snow-white beard covered his jaw to protect against the wind, complementing his heavy, faded denim overalls, a thick red and black plaid flannel shirt, and a battered canvas cap. The loss of his wife a decade ago had stripped away Arthur's desire for idle chatter, leaving him a solitary figure who communicated mostly in concise nods. This shared, comfortable silence was precisely why Sam tolerated working here. Arthur never pried, never offered unwarranted sympathy, and never looked at the scarred veteran as if he were a fragile piece of glass. He simply pointed at broken machinery, negotiated a fair price, and let Sam work in absolute peace. Nearby, Major sat like a regal sentinel by Sam's open toolbox. The 5-year-old German shepherd ignored the freezing gusts ruffling his thick coat. His muscular body remained perfectly rigid, his ears pricked forward like radar dishes, constantly scanning the perimeter to guard his master's vulnerable position beneath the heavy machinery. The rhythmic clanking of Sam's wrench was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, resonant bark. It was not the low, rumbling growl Major used to warn off strangers, nor the frantic yapping of a dog chasing a field mouse. It was a singular, echoing alert, a distinct, purposeful call meant specifically to command Sam's immediate attention. Sam paused, his muscles instinctively locking for a fraction of a second, before the rational part of his brain registered the specific tone of the dog's voice. He slid out from beneath the cold machinery, wiping thick black grease from his hands onto a dirty rag, and followed the direction of the sound. Major was standing near the overgrown, neglected edge of the farm's property, where an entanglement of dead, thorny blackberry bushes and frozen weeds swallowed a cluster of forgotten agricultural relics. The dog's wet black nose was pressed firmly against the side of a large, cylindrical structure looming in the encroaching shadows. Sam walked over, his heavy work boots crunching loudly against the frozen dead grass. Pushing aside the brittle, thorny vines, he revealed a medium-sized, abandoned, galvanized steel feed silo. It had clearly been sitting there for decades, discarded and completely forgotten, its base partially swallowed by the frozen mud. It was roughly 12 feet in diameter and fully enclosed, a hollow shell of corrugated steel that had weathered countless brutal seasons. A dull, ghostly gray patina covered most of its surface, accented by blooming patches of dark orange rust along the bottom seams and the arched doorway. Yet it stood incredibly straight and structurally defiant. Sam pulled off his heavy leather glove and pressed his bare palm against the freezing, wavy metal of the silo's wall. The sudden, biting chill of the steel sent a physical jolt up his arm, but it was the unique, undulating texture of the corrugated surface beneath his fingertips that instantly triggered a profound awakening within his mind. The terrifying echoes of falling pine branches and the paralyzing anxiety of civilian life faded into absolute silence, completely overridden by the sharp, analytical focus of a Navy CB combat engineer. The rippled steel beneath his hand transported him miles and years away, back to the blistering deserts and chaotic forward operating bases of his deployments. He vividly remembered the Quonset huts, those iconic semicircular corrugated metal structures that had served as their barracks, command centers, and ultimate sanctuaries. His engineering mind, trained to build vital infrastructure in the heart of destruction, recognized exactly why those specific structures survived when everything else crumbled to dust. The corrugated folds were not a mere aesthetic choice. They were a marvel of physics. The wavy structure exponentially increased the rigidity and load-bearing capacity of the thin sheet metal, allowing it to withstand extreme external pressures. In the war zones, that curved folded geometry had successfully deflected the devastating shockwaves of incoming artillery and forced howling, abrasive sandstorms to slip harmlessly around them rather than tearing the walls apart. The shape inherently dispersed kinetic energy, eliminating flat surfaces that would otherwise take the full, punishing brunt of an impact. Standing in the freezing Oregon wind, Sam's vision shifted entirely. He no longer saw a rusting piece of agricultural trash. He saw a perfectly engineered physical shield. If the apocalyptic polar vortex brought hurricane-force winds and a crushing, freezing assault as the radio predicted, his decaying, flat-walled wooden cabin back in the woods would be ripped apart or slowly crushed under the weight of the ice. But this corrugated cylinder would force the Arctic winds to wrap around its aerodynamic curves, standing unyielding against nature's fury. Yet, a steel shell was still just a shell. While it could block the devastating wind and snow, metal was a fierce conductor of temperature. Without a way to retain heat, it would turn into a freezing icebox within minutes, accelerating hypothermia. Sam stepped back, his mind racing through thermodynamic calculations, when he noticed a pile of debris scattered just a few feet away from the silo's base. It was the collapsed, rotting remains of an old blacksmith's forge that Arthur Miller's grandfather had likely built a century ago. Mixed within the decayed, moss-covered wooden beams and the frozen earth were dozens of heavy, blackened bricks. Sam crouched down, brushing away the frost to pick one up. It was incredibly dense, significantly heavier than a standard clay brick, its surface scarred and permanently scorched by decades of extreme, localized heat. They were refractory fire bricks. The final crucial piece of the survival puzzle clicked into place with absolute clarity. Fire bricks were scientifically designed to absorb intense thermal energy and radiate it slowly over a prolonged period. If he lined the interior of the corrugated steel silo with these bricks, creating a thermal mass around his small cast-iron wood stove, the bricks would capture the fire's heat. They would prevent the warmth from instantly escaping through the metal walls, steadily radiating heat into the interior long after the fire burned down to mere embers. The corrugated silo would act as the indestructible outer shield against the apocalyptic storm, and the blackened fire bricks would serve as the beating, radiant heart, keeping them alive inside. Sam stood up, his breathing steady, feeling a surge of absolute, unshakable purpose that he had not experienced since he took off his uniform. He walked back across the frozen field to where Arthur Miller was waiting by the now purring combine harvester. Arthur gave a slow, approving nod at the sound of the healthy, rhythmic engine and reached into the deep pocket of his overalls, pulling out a worn, cracked leather wallet to pay the agreed-upon cash for the grueling labor. Sam gently but firmly raised a grease-stained hand, stopping the old farmer's movement. He didn't want the cash. He didn't need paper money in a world that was about to freeze over. Pointing a calloused finger toward the overgrown edge of the property, Sam looked Arthur directly in the eyes. In a quiet, unwavering voice that cut clearly through the biting wind, Sam asked to trade his entire afternoon of backbreaking mechanical labor for the rusting tin can in the weeds and the pile of blackened bricks beside it. Arthur followed Sam's gaze, looking at the abandoned, useless junk, then back at the scarred veteran and his fiercely loyal dog. The old farmer didn't ask why a man would want a pile of heavy, rusted garbage instead of warm cash. He simply nodded once, sealing the unorthodox deal without a single word. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the farm into a deep, freezing twilight, Sam rested his hand on Major's warm head. In the eyes of the stoic farmer and the rest of the world, Sam had just worked for free to haul away heavy scrap metal, but in the awakened mind of the CB combat engineer, he had just secured the irreplaceable foundation of an impenetrable fortress. The biting frost of early dawn clung stubbornly to the cracked windshield of Sam's battered 1978 Ford F250 as he navigated the rutted dirt road back to the Miller farm. The old truck was a resilient beast of faded blue paint, groaning suspension, and a reliable engine that mirrored its owner's quiet endurance. Arriving at the overgrown edge of the property, Sam parked the heavy vehicle near the abandoned corrugated steel silo. The freezing air was absolutely still, holding its breath before the impending arrival of the catastrophic polar vortex. Today was not about repairing tractors for cash. Today was about dismantling a rusted behemoth and hauling a life-saving fortress back to his isolated land. Standing before the 12-foot-tall metal cylinder, Sam carefully assessed the daunting task. The structure was built from curved, overlapping panels of galvanized steel, held together tightly by hundreds of heavy, industrial-grade bolts that had spent decades fusing with the creeping rust. Pulling his collar up against the bitter wind, Sam sprayed a generous coat of penetrating oil onto the lowest ring of rusted joints. He waited a few minutes for the chemical to bite through the decay, then clamped his heavy wrench onto the first bolt. Straining his shoulders, he applied every ounce of his weight, but the oxidized metal refused to yield. The the joint was completely seized. Brute force seemed to be the only remaining option. Sam walked back to his toolbox and retrieved a heavy, short-handled 5-pound sledgehammer. Taking a deep breath, he swung the solid iron head directly against the seized joint to crack the rust. The impact against the hollow, corrugated steel chamber produced a deafening, metallic explosion. The acoustic resonance amplified the strike, sending a violent, echoing shockwave across the frozen valley. In a fraction of a second, the freezing Oregon morning completely vanished. The sharp, reverberating crash did not process as a hammer strike in Sam's traumatized brain. It registered instantly and viscerally as the thunderous detonation of a high-explosive mortar shell. The metallic taste of the cold air suddenly morphed into the suffocating, acrid stench of burning cordite and scorching desert sand. Another phantom explosion rocked his mind, louder than the first. Sam dropped the heavy sledgehammer as if it were glowing hot iron. His knees buckled instantly beneath him, hitting the unyielding frosted earth with a painful thud. Collapsing onto his side, his calloused hands violently clamped over his ears in a desperate, futile attempt to block out the deafening screams of a war zone that existed entirely within his own shattered memory. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow gasps, his lungs completely unable to draw in the freezing oxygen. He was drowning in the invisible shrapnel of his past. Major did not hesitate. The moment the heavy sledgehammer slipped from Sam's grasp, the 5-year-old German shepherd abandoned his vigilant guard post, moving with the blinding speed and absolute certainty of a highly trained medical lifeline. Major did not whimper or bark, understanding that in the chaotic theater of Sam's mind, noise was the ultimate enemy. Instead, the massive dog thrust himself directly into the epicenter of Sam's panic. Using his powerful front paws, Major pried Sam's trembling arms away from his face and forced his way into the tight space between Sam's curled chest and knees. With calculated precision, the 70-pound animal threw his entire body weight heavily across Sam's torso, applying a deep, grounding pressure therapy. Sam squeezed his eyes shut, his body violently shaking, trapped in the crossfire of his flashbacks. But then, a distinct warm physical sensation pierced through the agonizing cold of the memory. Major aggressively nudged his wet, warm nose firmly under Sam's quivering chin, forcing the veteran's head up while letting out a deep, rhythmic sigh. Sam's trembling hands instinctively reached out, his fingers burying themselves deep into the coarse, thick fur of the dog's neck. Beneath the heavy coat, Sam could feel the slow, steady, absolute rhythm of Major's heartbeat acting as a metronome of reality. He focused entirely on that singular cadence, matching his own erratic, gasping breaths to the calm rise and fall of the dog's chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the burning desert sands faded back into the frosted Oregon weeds, and the phantom artillery was replaced by the quiet, whistling wind. Sam opened his eyes, looking down into Major's unwavering amber eyes, realizing the dog hadn't just guarded him. He had physically dragged him back from the abyss. Sitting up slowly, Sam wiped the icy sweat from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained hand and rested his head against Major's neck for one long, silent moment of gratitude. He looked back at the towering metal silo, knowing he could not afford another auditory trigger. The brute force method of an infantryman had failed. He needed to rely entirely on the silent, calculated intelligence of a Navy Seabee engineer. Walking over to his battered Ford truck, Sam pulled out a heavy canvas bag filled with thick nylon ropes, steel carabiners, and a set of heavy-duty pulleys. He looked up at a massive ancient oak tree whose thick branches stretched out directly over the abandoned structure. Climbing onto the roof of his truck, Sam tossed the rope over the sturdiest oak branch, meticulously constructing a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage block and tackle pulley system. He hooked one end of the reinforced steel cables to the heavy rusted bolts on the silo panels and secured the other end to the powerful mechanical winch on the front bumper of his Ford. Instead of smashing the metal, he would let physics do the heavy lifting. Sam engaged the truck's winch, causing the steel cable to pull taut with a low, metallic groan. The pulley system multiplied the pulling force exponentially, creating a slow, immense, and completely silent pressure that sheared the rusted bolts cleanly off with a quiet snap. Working with a newfound rhythmic fluidity, Sam lowered the heavy curved steel panels safely into the long bed of his Ford F250. He repeated the calculated process for hours, attaching cables, engaging the winch, breaking the rust with mechanical advantage, and lowering the steel. It was no longer a chaotic battle of noise. It had become a quiet, deliberate symphony of engineering, while Major watched intently, his tail giving an approving wag. Once the last curved panel was stacked, Sam turned his attention to the collapsed blacksmith's forge, methodically gathering the heavy, soot-stained refractory fire bricks. His muscles screamed in exhaustion as he carried them, stacking the blackened stones that would soon become the thermal heart of his future home. By mid-afternoon, the suspension of the old Ford truck groaned heavily under the immense weight of the scavenged steel and dense fire bricks. The abandoned corner of the Miller farm was now completely empty, stripped of its rusted treasures. Sam closed the heavy tailgate, securing the load with thick ratchet straps. His body ached deeply, his hands were blistered, and the traumatic echoes of the morning still lingered faintly. But as he opened the passenger door for Major, a rare, faint smile touched his rugged face. He climbed behind the steering wheel and turned the ignition, the old engine roaring to life with a steady, comforting rumble against the encroaching cold. As they drove back toward the dense, isolating pines of the Cascade Mountains, the heavy steel panels rattled softly in the truck bed. To anyone else, it sounded like a truck full of junk. But to Sam Higgins, driving into the teeth of an impending Arctic apocalypse, it sounded exactly like hope. The heavy snow-tread tires of the Ford F250 crunched to a definitive halt in the small, pine-rimmed clearing, just as the first bruised hues of twilight bled into the overcast Oregon sky. Sam Higgins killed the engine, the sudden silence of the forest feeling heavy and ominous. As he stepped out of the cab, a freezing wind, sharper and more aggressive than it had been at dawn, slapped his face. The apocalyptic polar vortex was no longer a distant, crackling warning on a rusted radio. It was a physical weight pressing down on the Cascade Mountains, causing the mercury to plummet with every passing hour. Sam stood for a long moment, looking at the dilapidated wooden cabin that had been his sanctuary for years, and then at the stack of curved steel panels resting in the truck bed. His analytical mind, sharpened by years of tactical construction, made a swift and unsentimental decision. The 12-foot diameter of the silo was far too small to encapsulate the existing rotting structure. Instead of trying to shield a sinking ship, he would have to abandon the old cabin entirely and turn the metal cylinder into his new primary fortress. The wooden shack was no longer a home. It was now merely a supply depot waiting to be cannibalized for the survival of the pack. Operating with the relentless mechanical efficiency of a man fighting a ticking clock, Sam immediately grabbed his crowbar. He did not feel the ache in his shoulders or the sting in his blistered palms as he began violently dismantling the interior of his old cabin. He bypassed the rotting exterior logs, focusing his efforts entirely on stripping away the dry, salvageable pine boards that lined the inner walls and the sturdy floorboards. Each board he pried loose was a piece of his past, but in the face of the encroaching freeze, sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. His muscles, already screaming from the morning's brutal labor at the Miller farm, pushed through the wall of exhaustion as he amassed a formidable pile of usable timber near the truck. Before he could even think about erecting the heavy steel walls, Sam knew he had to address the most insidious enemy of winter survival, the freezing ground. The very earth beneath their feet would act as a massive, unrelenting thermal sink, violently sucking the warmth out of any structure sitting directly upon it. To sever this fatal connection, Sam walked to a forgotten, overgrown mound at the far edge of his property, a massive pile of industrial coal slag left behind by a defunct logging railway nearly a century ago. Using a rusted wheelbarrow, he hauled dozens of grueling loads of the gritty, porous black material, spreading it out into a thick, elevated circular foundation pad. The porous nature of the coal slag trapped millions of microscopic pockets of dead air, creating a highly effective, natural thermal break between the permafrost and his future floor. It was a foundation built on the forgotten debris of the past, designed to protect his future. Once the insulated foundation was firmly compacted and leveled, Sam began the laborious process of bolting the corrugated steel panels together in a tight, perfectly vertical ring. The 12-foot steel cylinder rose steadily against the backdrop of the dying pine forest, its aerodynamic curves standing defiantly against the howling wind. But a steel shell alone was a death trap, an icebox waiting to freeze its occupants. It needed a thick, impenetrable winter coat. Sam retrieved several heavy, compressed bales of rock wool, a dense, fire-resistant industrial mineral fiber he had salvaged months ago from an abandoned boiler room. Moving with rhythmic military precision, he began packing the scratchy, fibrous rock wool tightly against the inner valleys of the freezing corrugated steel. Working inward, he then took the salvaged pine boards from his old cabin, carefully bending and nailing them to a makeshift wooden frame to form the innermost lining of the cylinder. It was an incredibly labor-intensive process, requiring him to fight the stubborn wood to follow the curve of the metal, but the result was a masterful three-tiered defense system. He had created an unyielding aerodynamic steel outer shield to deflect the wind, a dense rock wool core to trap every precious watt of thermal energy, and a warm, breathable wooden interior to provide comfort. In the very center of the elevated coal slag floor, he meticulously laid down the heavy, black and refractory fire bricks he had brought from the Miller farm, creating a massive, heat-absorbing hearth where his small cast-iron stove would soon become the beating heart of their world. The domed roof of the silo presented the next critical engineering challenge. In the brutal logic of thermodynamics, heat naturally rises, and a poorly insulated roof would allow all of their precious warmth to hemorrhage directly into the Arctic sky. Sam dragged out several large, rigid foam insulation boards he had stored in his shed for a project that the war in his head had never allowed him to finish. Measuring and cutting the foam with a sharp utility knife, he wedge-fitted the thick insulating pieces tightly into the steel dome, sealing every microscopic gap with expanding spray foam. However, a CB combat engineer understood that perfectly sealing a small space was a double-edged sword. If the structure was completely airtight, the moisture from their breath and the heat of the fire would create rapid, deadly condensation, causing it to rain freezing water inside the silo, eventually leading to lethal black mold or even suffocation. Climbing a wooden ladder, his breath hitching in the freezing air, Sam carefully cut a precise circular ventilation hole near the apex of the domed roof. He installed a handmade sheet metal damper valve that could be manually opened and closed from the inside, allowing him to control the airflow with surgical precision. He wiped a mixture of sawdust and cold sweat from his brow and climbed down, walking over to where Major was resting. The large German shepherd was lying comfortably on a bed of fresh, fragrant pine shavings, his amber eyes watching Sam's every movement with a calm, unwavering trust that felt like a physical weight on Sam's heart. Sam knelt in the wood dust, burying his rough, calloused hands into the thick fur behind the dog's ears, scratching the exact spot Major loved most. "A house needs to breathe, Major, or it'll suffocate from the inside out," Sam muttered, his voice gravelly and barely rising above the whistle of the wind tearing through the trees outside. The dog let out a low, rumbling sigh of contentment, a sound that briefly chased away the profound, haunting isolation of the frozen woods. The inner sanctuary was nearing completion, but Sam's survival protocol extended far beyond the walls of the silo. He knew that when the polar vortex truly hit, the dirt roads would transform into impassable sheets of solid, treacherous ice, rendering even the heavy Ford truck a useless hunk of metal. If an absolute emergency occurred, if they ran out of wood, or if Major was injured, they could not afford to be immobilized. Gathering the leftover strips of corrugated sheet metal and several thick, sturdy pine beams, Sam set up a makeshift workbench under the dying, flickering light of his porch. He worked methodically into the freezing night, his breath pluming in the thick white clouds under the harsh, clinical glare of a battery-powered work lamp. Using heavy bolts and metal shears, he fashioned the curved steel scraps into smooth, frictionless runners, attaching them securely to a heavy wooden platform. It was a rugged, highly durable makeshift sled, designed specifically to be pulled over deep snow and solid ice. It was wide enough to haul emergency firewood, or, if the unthinkable happened, to transport an injured soul. He drove the final iron nails into the reinforced wooden joints, the sharp, rhythmic ringing of the hammer echoing into the dark, silent woods. Because of Major's intervention at the farm, the sound of the hammer no longer triggered the paralyzing explosions of his past. It was now simply the sound of a man fiercely preparing to fight for his life and the life of his friend. Sam lowered the hammer, his fingers tracing the smooth, cold steel runners of the completed sled. He looked up at the sky, which had turned into an abyss of absolute starless black. The temperature was plummeting rapidly now, freezing the very moisture in the air into tiny, glittering ice crystals that danced in the light of his lamp. The ultimate test of the CB's rusted fortress was no longer a distant threat approaching through the trees. It was standing at the door. The arrival of the polar vortex was not marked by a sudden, dramatic crash, but by an eerie, predatory silence that seemed to suck the very life out of the Cascade Mountains. The birds had long since vanished, and even the shadows of the pines seemed to huddle closer to the frozen earth in anticipation. Then, with a sound like the tearing of the world's fabric, the sky simply disappeared. A wall of blinding horizontal white, driven by hurricane-force winds, slammed into the valley with a shriek that sounded like 1,000 banshees. This was no ordinary winter gale. It was a physical assault from the Arctic, a frozen tidal wave intended to scour the earth clean of anything fragile. Down in the valley, the traditional square-built homes began to groan under the punishment. Their flat vertical walls stood in stubborn, arrogant opposition to the wind, taking the full, crushing brunt of the kinetic energy. Inside those houses, walls vibrated with a terrifying intensity, and the freezing draft, the ghost of the north, found every microscopic gap in the window frames and door seals, stealing the warmth from the hearths of families huddled in fear. But high up in the lonely clearing, tucked against the obsidian shadows of the pines, the rusted steel cylinder stood in quiet, defiant mockery of the storm. Sam Higgins sat on a small wooden stool inside the silo, the interior bathed in the soft, flickering amber glow of the cast-iron stove. He held a chipped ceramic mug of scalding black coffee in his calloused hands, the steam rising in a steady, undisturbed column toward the insulated dome. Outside, the world was a chaotic nightmare of horizontal snow and snapping branches, but inside, the silence was absolute. Sam listened with the trained ear of a CB engineer, analyzing the acoustic signature of the storm. He could hear the wind hit the curved exterior of the corrugated steel, but instead of the violent, bone-shaking shudder of a flat wall, there was only a low, rhythmic hiss. It was the sound of a physical law being proven in real time. The aerodynamic cylinder forced the aggressive currents to split and slide harmlessly around its radius, dispersing the pressure and leaving the structure as unmoved as a boulder in a rushing river. The three-tiered defense he had labored over, the steel shell, the dense rock wool, and the pine lining, worked in perfect silent harmony. The temperature outside had plummeted to a lethal 30 degrees below zero, but the blackened fire bricks at his feet were doing their silent, essential work. They had absorbed the intense thermal energy of the fire and were now radiating a deep, penetrating heat that soaked into the very air of the room. Sam looked down at Major. The 5-year-old German shepherd was sprawled out in a state of profound, undisturbed sleep on a thick, recycled wool rug near the stove. The dog's chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence of total security. Not a single strand of his coarse brown-black fur stirred. There were no drafts here, no icy fingers reaching in from the dark. Major's amber eyes were closed tight, his paws occasionally twitching as he chased phantom rabbits in a dream world where the sun was always warm. A sudden rhythmic thumping at the heavy reinforced steel door broke Sam's meditation. It was not the erratic drumming of the wind. It was a deliberate, desperate franticness. Sam's hand instinctively went to the heavy iron bolt, his pulse quickening with a ghost of his old combat readiness. He slid the latch back and hauled the door open just enough to reveal a sliver of the white hell outside. Tumbling through the gap, accompanied by a swirl of glittering ice crystals, was a figure nearly buried in snow. It was Thomas "Tommy" Vance, a young man in his early 20s who lived in a small, poorly insulated trailer a mile down the ridge. Tommy was a lanky, nervous youth with a shock of bright red hair, now matted with ice, and pale, freckled skin that had turned a dangerous mottled blue from the cold. He was a local scrapper, someone Sam had occasionally shared a silent nod with at the general store. Tommy's eyes were wide with a primal terror, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps that rattled in his thin chest. Sam didn't waste words. He grabbed the boy by the collar of his thin, inadequate nylon jacket and hauled him toward the radiance of the fire bricks. Major had woken instantly, standing up with a low, inquisitive tilt of his head, but sensing the boy's desperation, he nudged Tommy's frozen hand with his warm nose, a silent gesture of welcome into the pack's sanctuary. Sam handed the boy a spare wool blanket and a fresh mug of coffee, watching as the heat began the slow, painful process of thawing Tommy's frozen limbs. The young man looked around the interior of the silo, his eyes tracing the curved pine walls and the massive glowing hearth, his expression shifting from terror to sheer disbelief. "Mr. Higgins, please," Tommy managed to choke out, his teeth chattering so violently he could barely form the words. "My trailer, the roof, it just snapped under the weight. The heater died an hour ago. I thought I was going to freeze to death before I reached the road." "Drink the coffee, Tommy," Sam said, his voice a low, steady rumble that provided its own kind of warmth. "You're in the only place on this mountain that isn't shaking right now." The young man took a long, shivering sip, the color slowly returning to his pale cheeks. "It's like a different world in here," he whispered, staring at the walls. "The wind. I can't even feel the walls move. How did you build this? Everyone down the hill is losing their minds." Sam nodded once, a brief, grim movement of his head as he returned to his stool. "Physics, kid," he replied shortly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Square corners catch the wind, curves let it go. You don't fight a storm like this. You just make yourself a ghost in its path." He looked at the sheet metal damper valve he had installed at the apex of the roof. It was open just a sliver, allowing a constant, invisible exchange of fresh air that kept the moisture from building up. The engineering was holding. The Seabee's fortress was not just a shield for himself and his dog anymore. It had become a lifeboat for a soul drifting in the white abyss. Outside, a massive pine branch, overloaded with hundreds of pounds of ice, finally gave way and crashed onto the frozen earth with a sound like a gunshot. Sam didn't flinch. Major didn't even lift his head from his paws. The storm continued to scream, hurling its frozen fury against the steel. But inside the rusted cylinder, there was only the steady hum of the fire and the deep, quiet peace of a battle already won. Nature was offering its most brutal insult, and for the first time in years, Sam Higgins found himself smiling back into the darkness. The polar vortex continued its relentless siege outside the steel walls, but inside the silo, the battle for survival had shifted from structural integrity to the management of life-sustaining energy. Sam Higgins knew that while his three-tiered walls kept the cold at bay, a static defense would eventually wither without a constant, efficient source of heat. The small cast-iron stove he had initially installed was a hungry, demanding beast that devoured seasoned oak with a frantic appetite and sent nearly half of its thermal potential screaming straight up the flue. To a Navy Seabee, such inefficiency was a tactical failure. Sam needed a system that didn't just burn fuel, but stored it. A thermal battery that could pulse with warmth long after the last ember had died. He set his sights on the pile of soot-stained refractory fire bricks and the collection of heavy ceramic flue liners he had salvaged from the collapsed blacksmith's forge. He was going to build a rocket mass heater, the ceramic heart of his fortress. The construction began in the center of the coal slag foundation, a task Sam undertook with the solemnity of a stonemason. Unlike a traditional fireplace, the rocket mass heater relied on a J-shaped combustion chamber designed to create a clean, high-temperature burn through an insulated internal chimney. Sam meticulously mortared the blackened fire bricks, shaping the heat riser where the wood gases would re-burn at incredible temperatures. He moved with a rhythmic fluidity, his calloused hands coating each brick in a slurry of clay and sand. As he worked, young Tommy Vance watched from his cocoon of wool blankets, his eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and budding curiosity. Tommy had spent his short life in a world of disposable trailers and cheap electric heaters. Watching Sam manipulate raw stone and physics to create warmth was like witnessing an ancient, forgotten magic. To expand the heater's reach, Sam didn't lead the exhaust pipe directly outside. Instead, he laid a serpentine path of heavy ceramic tubes, thick, terracotta-colored cylinders, along the base of the inner wall. He then encased these pipes in a long, wide bench made of more fire brick and packed earth, creating a structure that wrapped halfway around the interior circumference of the silo. This was the thermal mass. Based on the principle of thermal inertia, the bricks would slowly absorb the scorching heat from the exhaust gases as they traveled through the ceramic labyrinth. Once saturated, the mass would patiently radiate a gentle, sun-like warmth back into the air for 12 to 15 hours, even after the fire had gone out. "It's not just a stove, Tommy," Sam grunted, his voice echoing slightly inside the steel drum as he smoothed the final layer of clay over the bench. "It's a battery. It breathes in the wood and stores the sun." As the first fire was lit in the new hearth, the silo underwent a profound transformation. The erratic, sharp heat of the previous stove was replaced by a deep, resonant warmth that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. The ceramic bench, which Sam had finished with a smooth, dark clay plaster, began to glow with a soft, invisible infrared energy. It didn't take long for the most discerning occupant of the silo to take notice. Major stood up and sniffed the long brick bench. He felt the radiating warmth against his chest, and, with a low groan of approval, hopped up onto the wide surface. The German shepherd stretched his long limbs across the heated ceramic, his head resting on his front paws as he felt the warmth seep into his tired muscles. The bench had become Major's undisputed favorite sanctuary, a place where the Arctic world outside felt like a distant memory. The silence of their labor was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic scraping against the steel exterior. Sam froze, his hand tightening around his trowel, but Major didn't growl. He merely lifted his head, his ears twitching with curiosity. When Sam cracked the heavy steel door, he found a small, shivering creature huddled in the lee of the silo's curve. It was a calico cat, perhaps 4 years old, her fur a chaotic tapestry of orange, black, and white. She was dangerously thin, her ribs visible beneath a coat matted with frozen sleet, and one of her ears had been tattered by a previous encounter with a predator. Despite her desperate state, her green eyes held a fierce, unyielding spark. This was Barnaby, a semi-feral mouser from the Miller farm, who must have followed the thermal plume rising from Sam's new chimney through the blizzard. Tommy gasped as Sam scooped the freezing feline into the warmth. "Is she going to be okay?" the boy asked, his voice cracking. Sam didn't answer immediately. He placed the cat on the far end of the heated brick bench, well away from Major's territory. Barnaby didn't hiss or flee. She simply collapsed onto the warm ceramic, her frozen paws kneading the heated surface instinctively. Major watched her with a calm, patriarchal indifference, recognizing that the shelter was now a lifeboat for more than just their kind. Sam fetched a small tin of sardines, placing it near the cat. "She's a survivor, Tommy," Sam said softly, watching the cat eat with frantic desperation. "Just like the rest of us. She just needed a place where the heart was still beating." As the night deepened and the wind outside reached a crescendo that made the pines scream, the interior of the silo remained a pocket of absolute, radiant peace. Tommy had finally drifted into a deep, restorative sleep, his lanky frame stretched out on a cot near the heater. Barnaby, her belly full, had curled into a tight ball of fur on the warm bench, her rhythmic purring blending with the low, steady hum of the rocket heater. Sam sat on the floor with his back against the heated mass, his arm draped over Major's neck. The ceramic heart of the silo was pulsing, sending waves of life-sustaining heat through the small space. For the first time since he had returned from the desert, the internal roar of Sam's memories was quiet. He was a guardian of a ceramic heart, and as long as that heart beat, the winter could not touch them. The polar vortex, having exhausted its supply of soft white powder, decided to reach into a more lethal quiver. By the early hours of the third day, the howling wind shifted to a wet, heavy groan as a layer of warm air collided with the frozen surface, creating the dreaded Oregon phenomenon, a massive ice storm. This was the crystal gale, a meteorological nightmare where rain froze instantly upon contact, encasing every living and inanimate thing in a suffocating, transparent shroud of ice. In the valley below, the world began to shatter under the mounting weight. This was no longer about the cold, it was about gravity. Every branch, every needle, and every power line became a structural liability. The weight was immense, a relentless physical pressure that turned fragile branches into glass spears and heavy power lines into sagging, electrified anchors. One by one, the ancient oak trees of the surrounding valley groaned and split, their internal fibers snapping with the sound of rapid-fire artillery echoes throughout the dark, frozen woods. The town's power grid, already strained to its breaking point, gave a final, spectacular blue-white flash as a transformer exploded, plunging thousands into a darkness that felt as cold and final as the grave. But high up on the ridge, tucked away in the obsidian shadows of the pines, the rusted fortress of Sam Higgins played a different tune. As the freezing rain slammed against the silo, it met the smooth, galvanized surfaces and the aerodynamic curves that Sam had so meticulously engineered with his CB hands. Unlike the flat, wooden roofs in the valley that were now buckling and groaning under thousands of pounds of crystal weight, the ice had no purchase on the silo's dome. Every drop of freezing rain that hit the curved steel was either deflected by the rising wind or slid immediately toward the ground, unable to find a ledge or a corner to cling to. The structure didn't fight the weight. It simply shed it like a duck sheds water. Inside the silo, the only evidence of the assault was the rhythmic, crystalline tink, tink, tink of ice pellets bouncing off the metal shell, a delicate sound that felt like thousands of tiny diamonds falling onto a tin drum, providing a strange, haunting soundtrack to their survival. The thermometer Sam had mounted to the curved pine interior, a simple wooden instrument with a red mercury line, stood as a proud, silent sentinel of his success. Outside, the world had plunged into a lethal -20 degrees Celsius, a temperature that turned a man's breath into needles and made the very air feel like a solid, freezing wall. Inside the silo, however, the needle of the thermometer hovered steadily and triumphantly at a defiant 20 degrees Celsius. The rocket mass heater was performing its duty with silent, ceramic grace, humming with a low, vibrant energy. The massive brick bench was now fully saturated with thermal energy, pulsing with a deep, radiant heat that kept the air dry and the spirits high. The small ventilation hole at the apex of the roof, fitted with its handmade sheet metal damper, exhaled a thin, ghost-like plume of wood smoke into the freezing night, ensuring that the moisture from their breath never had the chance to turn into the deadly indoor rain that Sam had feared. The peaceful hum of the heater was suddenly interrupted by a muffled, heavy thud against the base of the silo, followed by a low, desperate groan that barely rose above the whistle of the wind. Major, who had been dozing on the heated bench, was on his feet in a second, his ears forward and a low, protective rumble vibrating deep in his chest. Barnaby, the calico mouser, puffed her fur into a defensive ball and arched her back, her green eyes fixed intently on the steel door. Sam grabbed his battery-powered work lamp and slid the heavy iron bolt back with a sharp metallic clack. As the door creaked open, a gust of needle-sharp air swirled into the room, carrying with it a man who looked like a ghost carved from solid ice. He was tall, perhaps 60 years of age, with a frame that had once been powerful, but was now bent and broken by the weight of a frozen world. This was Elias Thorne, a retired forest ranger who lived in a cabin tucked even deeper into the pines than Sam's clearing. Elias was a man of the old school, with a face that looked like a topographical map of the Cascades, deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and frost, and framed by a thick silver beard that was now matted with frozen rain and glittering ice crystals. He was known to the locals as a man of few words and even fewer smiles, a hermit who respected the ancient mountains far more than the people who lived among them. He was dressed in a heavy, grease-stained canvas coat, but even that rugged garment hadn't been enough to stop the damp, invasive chill from reaching his bones when a massive pine had crashed through his roof an hour ago. "Higgins!" Elias wheezed, his voice sounding like sandpaper on stone as he stumbled into the warm, amber light of the silo. "My ridge, it's gone. The ice, it's breaking the world. My roof didn't stand a chance." Sam didn't hesitate. He caught the older man by the arm and guided him toward the heated brick bench. Tommy Vance jumped up, his face pale but his hands remarkably steady, as he helped Elias peel off the ice-crusted coat. Major, sensing the ancient authority and the deep exhaustion in the ranger, didn't bark. Instead, he walked over and rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, a silent gesture of solidarity between two old souls who had survived too many winters. Barnaby, sensing the shift in tension, settled back onto the bricks, watching the newcomer with a cautious, unblinking gaze that seemed to judge his worthiness. Sam handed Elias a tin cup of hot tea laced with heavy honey, the steam curling around the old man's silver beard. "Get your boots off, Elias," Sam commanded softly but firmly. "The mass is hot. Put your feet directly on the bricks. Let the stone do the work." The ranger looked around the interior of the silo, his eyes wide with a professional's deep appreciation for the engineering. He saw the way the curves of the wall deflected the sound of the wind and the way the ceramic heater stored the life of the fire. "I've lived in these mountains 40 years, Elias muttered, his voice slowly regaining some of its resonance as the heat seeped into his limbs. "I've seen storms that could swallow houses, but this thing you've built, it's a miracle of geometry, Sam. My cabin has been standing since the 50s, and it couldn't take the weight. But this tin can, it's just laughing at the ice." As the night wore on, the silo became a sanctuary of shared history and whispered stories. Elias spoke of the ice storm of '98, comparing notes with Sam's tactical experiences in the high deserts. Tommy listened, captivated, realizing for the first time that survival wasn't just about luck or brute strength. It was about the stubborn, calculated refusal to be broken by the elements. Barnaby eventually crawled into Elias's lap, her rhythmic purring adding a third layer of sound to the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the wind tearing through the trees outside. Outside, the crystal gale continued its lethal work, encasing the world in a beautiful lethal glass. But inside the silo, the heat remained at a defiant 20 degrees Celsius. The Seabees fortress had survived its most treacherous test, proving that even when the sky falls, a heart built on curves and ceramic can never be crushed. The third day of the total blackout didn't arrive with a traditional sunrise, but rather with a subtle thickening of the gray gloom that made the Cascade Mountains feel like a tomb carved from ancient cold obsidian. Inside the silo, the air remained a golden, dry sanctuary, a testament to the ceramic heart that Sam had built with his own calloused hands. However, the fragile peace was shattered at exactly 4 a.m. Major didn't just wake from his slumber on the heated bench. He erupted with a primal intensity that Sam had only seen during their most desperate days in the desert. The German shepherd lunged toward the curved pine wall, his powerful claws digging deep, jagged furrows into the wood as he let out a series of low, rhythmic baying sounds. It was a haunting, guttural communication that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of Sam's bones, a signal of distress that only an animal of his caliber could perceive through the howling storm. Sam Higgins stood up instantly, his boots hitting the floor with a hollow thud. He met the dog's amber gaze in the flickering light of the hearth. There was no madness in those eyes, only a desperate telepathic urgency that screamed of a looming disaster. Elias Thorne, leaning against the warm bricks of the rocket heater, stopped sharpening his blade, his silver beard catching the amber glow of the embers. The old ranger's voice was a gravelly whisper that seemed to carry the weight of the forest. "He's not smelling a predator, Sam. The wind has turned in the last hour. It's carrying the scent of a town that has finally stopped fighting. It smells like silence, and in this cold, silence is the sound of the end." Sam's mind locked onto a single, terrifying image: Dr. Aris Hayes and the small medical clinic down in the valley. He could see her sharp, avian features and her dark hair, usually pinned in a fierce, practical bun, now likely disheveled as she fought a losing battle against the laws of physics. Dr. Hayes was the valley's iron-willed healer, a woman whose hands always carried the faint, sharp sting of antiseptic, and whose clinical eyes had seen every birth and death in this town for over 30 years. Her clinic was the beating heart of the valley's fragile health, housing a small, precious treasury of insulin, pediatric antibiotics, and critical vaccines. These were biological glass, fragile vials that would shatter into useless frozen shards if the temperature dropped even a fraction of a degree too far for too long. Without power for 3 days, and with the crystal gale encasing the world in ice, that heart was stopping. The Ford truck outside was a dead beast, an immobile monument to the arrogance of modern machines on a ridge that had been turned into a vertical sheet of glass. The wheels would find no purchase, and the engine would likely seize in the brutal atmosphere. But Sam Higgins was a Seabee. He didn't rely on internal combustion when the world broke. He relied on engineering and sheer stubborn will. From the deep shadows at the rear of the silo, he hauled out a sled of his own making, a low, predatory shape of reinforced high-density polyethylene and heavy steel runners designed specifically to bite into the most treacherous ice. He didn't speak a word as he retrieved the specialized leather pulling harness from its hook. He fitted the padded rig over Major's massive chest, the dog leaning into the straps with a rippling display of muscle under his thick, brown-black winter coat. Major was like a coiled spring, ready to release a lifetime of loyalty into a single, impossible task. Sam then turned his attention back to the glowing hearth. With a pair of heavy iron tongs, he carefully pried 3 glowing, white-hot fire bricks from the very center of the rocket mass heater. They were humming with stored life, radiating a fierce infrared energy that made the air shimmer. He wrapped the scorching stones in the thick, multi-layered wool blankets, nesting them carefully into a reinforced wooden crate mounted on the sled. He was creating a thermal lung, a portable incubator that would keep the medicine alive through the sub-zero trek. Elias Thorne stood up and handed Sam a heavy fur-lined parka and a pair of industrial-grade goggles, his weathered face tight with a grim respect. "The creek bed is your only hope, Sam," Elias advised. "It's the only path left that hasn't been completely claimed by the jagged edges of the gale. The hemlocks will shield you from the worst of the crosswinds." They stepped out into the night, and the cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical assault. At minus 25 degrees Celsius, the air was a solid, freezing weight that tried to seize Sam's lungs the moment he inhaled. "Mush!" he barked, the command cracking like a whip in the frozen silence. Major didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. The dog threw his entire 5-year-old soul into the harness, his paws finding purchase in the frozen crust with a rhythmic, scratching precision as they plunged into the white abyss. The forest around them had been transformed into a labyrinth of crystal chandeliers. Massive branches encased in 4 inches of solid ice hung low like lethal ornaments before snapping with the violence of a gunshot and crashing into the snow. Shards of glass ice rained down around them like shrapnel, but they didn't flinch or slow their pace. Sam ran behind the sled, his breath forming a long, white plume that trailed behind him like a ghost. His gloved hand gripped the guide rope until his knuckles turned as white as the storm itself. They were a single, dual-souled machine of flesh and fur, carving a path of heat through a world that had forgotten the very meaning of warmth. The clinic appeared through the freezing, crystalline haze like a ghost ship lost at sea. Inside, the windows were opaque with frost, and the air was deathly still. Dr. Hayes was a shadow among shadows, her hands trembling from the early stages of hypothermia as she prepared to bury her precious vials in a hole in the frozen earth beneath the floorboards, a desperate final gamble to save the town's future. When the door slammed open, Sam Higgins entered like a titan of frost, led by a steaming silver-furred beast that looked more wolf than dog in the dim light. The doctor gasped, her eyes falling on the smoking wooden crate on the sled. Sam didn't waste a single word on pleasantries. He flipped the lid of the crate, and the radiant, fierce heat of the fire bricks hit the room like a physical blessing, a piece of the silo's heart transported to the front lines. "The insulin, Aris! Get it in here now!" Sam grunted, his eyebrows matted with frozen sleet, and his voice sounding like cracked ice. "We're moving the entire clinic back to the hearths if we have to. My dog is the engine today, and these stones are the fuel. We don't let this town die in the dark." The rest of the night became a blurred, exhausting montage of rhythmic labor and frozen endurance. 3 separate times they returned to the ridge, battling the upward climb against the gravity of the ice. Major's chest was heaving in the frozen air, his powerful legs never faltering, his spirit unbroken, as they transported the valley's biological lifeblood to the few remaining houses where wood smoke still rose from the chimneys. By the time a bruised gray dawn finally bled across the jagged horizon, every critical vial of medicine had been secured in the makeshift thermal boxes. Major collapsed on the clinic floor, his fur matted with frozen sleet and his breath coming in slow, ragged gasps. When Sam's frozen glove finally touched the dog's head, the shepherd's tail gave a weak, defiant thump against the floorboards. They had looked directly into the frozen eyes of the crystal gale, and they hadn't blinked. As Sam stood in the doorway of the clinic, watching the first light touch the ice-covered valley, he knew the silo wasn't just a fortress for his own survival anymore. It had become a heart, a pulsing center of hope, and its warmth was now flowing through the very veins of the entire community, proving that even the longest winter cannot freeze a soul that refuses to go cold. The transition from the deadly grasp of the crystal gale to the first stirrings of a cascade spring did not happen with a sudden roar, but with a series of rhythmic, musical drips. The ice, once a suffocating shroud that threatened to crush the valley, began to surrender under the persistent gaze of a golden sun. As the thick shells of crystal slid from the pine needles and shattered upon the warming earth, the steel skin of Sam Higgins' silo emerged from the white abyss. It didn't look like a rusted relic anymore. Caught in the high-altitude light, the galvanized metal flashed like a polished diamond. To the people in the valley below, who were finally emerging from their dark, frozen homes, the silo on the ridge had become a lighthouse, a gleaming beacon of ingenuity that had pulsed with life when everything else had gone cold. The true victory, however, was not measured in gleaming steel, but in the small glass vials that remained intact and potent within the clinic's shelves. Thanks to Sam's improvised thermal battery bricks and the meticulous insulation barriers he had constructed around the medical storage units, the town's entire supply of life-saving medicine had survived the historic freeze. Dr. Eris Hayes stood in the center of her clinic, her sharp eyes scanning the inventory with a quiet, profound relief. She no longer smelled like the antiseptic of a battlefield medic. Today, the air in the clinic was filled with the scent of fresh pine and the steam of brewing coffee. The town was waking up, and it owed its first collective breath to the man in the silver tower. The lingering whispers of Sam being a reclusive outsider or a shadowy veteran vanished as quickly as the frost. The ridge path, once avoided out of a mix of fear and respect for Sam's privacy, now saw a steady stream of visitors. They didn't come with questions or demands. They came with tributes. Mrs. Gable, a stout woman with flour-dusted apron strings and a laugh that could be heard 3 houses away, arrived at the silo's reinforced door with a tray of blackberry pies, still steaming from her wood-fired oven. "For the engine of the mountain," she stated firmly, handing the tray to a bewildered Sam while reaching down to scratch Major behind the ears. The suspicion that had once clouded the town's perception of Sam had been replaced by a deep, communal gratitude. Among the visitors was a man who moved with a different kind of purpose. Mayor Marcus Vance, the father of young Tommy, made the trek up the ridge on a crisp Saturday morning. Marcus was a man who looked like he was carved from the very granite of the mountains, broad-shouldered, with a square jawline and a thick mane of salt and pepper hair. His eyes were a piercing blue, reflecting a lifetime of civil service and the heavy burden of leadership. Marcus had always been a pragmatist, but the sight of his son returning home safe, followed by the news of the medicine's survival, had softened the edges of his political armor. He stood before the silo, his hands tucked into the pockets of his heavy wool coat, looking up at the structure with genuine awe. "As Higgins," Marcus began, his voice a rich baritone that carried no trace of the usual politician's artifice. "I didn't just come here as a father to thank you for Tommy, though that is the greatest debt I'll ever owe. I came here as the mayor of this county. We spent 3 days watching our modern infrastructure fail us, while you sat up here in a fortress of your own making, laughing at the wind." He paused, looking at the rocket mass heater glowing through the open door. "The county board and I have reached a unanimous decision. We're launching a permanent cold hardiness project to retrofit our public buildings in low-income housing. We need a chief consultant, Sam. Someone who understands that a house is more than 4 walls. It's a living system. We're offering you the position, a stable salary, a full team, and the authority to build this valley into something that never breaks again." Sam didn't answer immediately. He looked down at Major, who was currently occupied with a group of local children. Among them was little Lily, a 6-year-old with bright copper pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, who was fearlessly using Major's broad back as a makeshift desk to draw pictures of birds. Major, the fierce warrior of the crystal gale, lay perfectly still, his amber eyes half-closed in contentment as the children's laughter filled the clearing. The soldier who had spent years running from the world, hiding in the desert of his memories and the steel of his silo, felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't the infrared heat of the fire bricks, it was the heat of belonging. Sam Higgins, the once lonely itinerant repairman, accepted the position. His life transformed from a series of scattered odd jobs into a journey of structural redemption. Throughout the following months, the silo became more than just his home. It became a classroom. On weekend afternoons, the front yard of the ridge clearing was often filled with the chatter of youth. Sam taught the older boys how to mix cob and lay fire brick for high-efficiency heaters, while the younger ones learned to build insulated nesting boxes for the birds returning to the Cascades. Barnaby the cat, now plump and sleek with a coat that shone like polished tortoiseshell, presided over these gatherings from the heights of the silo's dome, her tattered ear a badge of honor in her new peaceful kingdom. The income from the county position allowed Sam to finally finish the silo's interior, adding reclaimed oak bookshelves and a small, quiet workshop. But more importantly, the work gave him a reason to walk into town with his head held high. When he walked past the general store, people didn't look away. They nodded with a respect earned in the trenches of the storm. Sam had built his silo to be an island, a place where he could exist without the complications of other people's lives. But the storm had taught him a lesson that no engineering manual could provide. The strongest structure is not the one that stands alone, but the one that supports the entire weight of a community. As the late spring sun began to dip behind the obsidian peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, Sam sat on a hand-carved bench outside his door. He took a long, slow breath of the crisp air, feeling the steady presence of his home. Major rested his heavy head on Sam's knee, a silent companion whose loyalty had been forged in ice and tempered in fire. Sam ran his hand over the dog's thick fur, feeling the steady, calm heartbeat of his brother-in-arms. He looked out over the town, seeing the smoke rising from chimneys he had helped to reinforce, and for the first time in many years, the internal roar of the past was completely silent. He wasn't a man in hiding anymore. The world had reached out and claimed him, and as he sat in the radiant reflection of his steel home, Sam Higgins realized he was finally, truly home. The saga of Sam Higgins is not merely a triumph of steel, but a testament to the human spirit's refusal to remain in the cold. We often build silos of our own, walls of isolation and past hurt, believing safety lies in solitude. Yet, as the Crystal Gale proved, the strongest fortress is hollow without a shared purpose. Sam's journey reminds us that our greatest trials are not burdens to be hoarded, but tools meant to light the way for others. When we stop surviving for ourselves and start protecting one another, our own hearts, once frozen by silence, begin to beat with a renewed, radiant life. In the clarity following the storm, we recognize a sacred truth. No winter is bitter enough to extinguish a soul ignited by compassion. Sam's silo became a miracle not through engineering, but by becoming a vessel for a higher calling. Scripture tells us we are the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Sometimes God allows the storms to shake our foundations just to reveal the grace He has placed within us. A strength that only truly shines when we reach out to a neighbor in need. You are never left to face the ice alone. Every act of kindness is a brick in a fortress that no storm can ever tear down. If Sam and Major's journey moved you, please join our family. Share this story with someone sitting in their own cold silence today, needing to know that warmth is on the way. Comment with a moment of grace that sustained you, and subscribe for more stories of the sacred bond between humans and animals. May the Lord watch over you and keep your home secure. May His grace be the fire in your hearth and His peace be the roof over your head. God bless you and keep shining your light.
Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories about restoration and faith. And wherever you are, may God bless your home, guide your step, and bring life back into the place that once feel forgotten.